9 days. That is how long Kark Island has sat with all 3 of its loading berths completely empty. Not slowed down, not trimmed back, not running at half capacity while engineers fix some technical problem. 0. 9 straight days without a single barrel leaving the terminal that normally handles roughly 90% of everything Iran sells to the rest of the world. If you want to understand how unusual that is, you have to understand what Kark Island actually is. It's a small strip of coral and sand sitting in the northern end of the Persian Gulf, not even 20 square miles in total, and for decades it has functioned as the financial heart of the Iranian regime. Most of the Iranian coastline is too shallow to load the huge tankers that carry crude oil across the world, so almost everything funnels through this one deep water point. When Kark goes quiet, the money that keeps the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps funded, that keeps proxy militias paid, that keeps the entire security apparatus of the regime running, starts to dry up in a very measurable, very public way. And it hasn't just slowed, it has stopped. For 9 days straight. The reason it has stopped is not because Iran decided to pause exports for maintenance or because of some accident at the terminal. It has stopped because of a deliberate, layered, multi-domain blockade that the United States has built around the Strait of Hormuz and the waters feeding into it. This isn't a single ship parked off the coast. This is a genuinely modern operation, and understanding how it's built tells you almost everything you need to know about how the United States military thinks about power projection in this decade. Start with the carrier strike group. The USS Abraham Lincoln has been on station for 237 days. Sit with that number for a second. That's not a routine deployment. That's not a quick show of force cruise. That's the better part of 8 months at sea for sailors and airmen who are living, working, launching, and recovering aircraft around the clock in one of the most contested strips of water on the planet. The air wing off that carrier, FA-18E Super Hornets, is flying combat air patrol and intercept missions, turning back tankers and cargo vessels that try to slip through toward Kark, working in coordination with Arleigh Burke-class destroyers that are doing what those ships have done for decades: standing picket, running intercept, and enforcing a wall of steel across shipping lanes that Iran cannot punch through with conventional naval assets. Layer on top of that Air Force F-35s flying in the region and a growing constellation of advanced surveillance drones, and what you get is not a blockade in the old sense of a line of battleships. It's a blockade built on persistent networked awareness. Every vessel that tries to move gets tracked, identified, and either escorted through if it's carrying humanitarian cargo, or turned around if it's trying to move Iranian crude. And that distinction matters enormously because it's the part almost nobody reporting on this story bothers to explain clearly. This is not a total indiscriminate shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz. According to Central Command's own numbers, 53 commercial vessels have been redirected, 2 have been disabled, and 2 have been boarded. But more than 30 ships carrying humanitarian aid have been allowed to pass straight through. That's not incidental. That's the entire point of a modern precision blockade. The United States isn't trying to strangle the civilian population of the region or spike global humanitarian crises. It's trying to cut off one specific revenue stream, oil money flowing to a regime that uses it to fund proxy warfare, while still allowing food, medicine, and other essential goods to move. That's a much harder operation to run than a blunt force shutdown would be, because it requires constant surveillance, constant verification of cargo manifests, and constant coordination between naval assets, air assets, and intelligence. But it's also a much smarter one because it removes Iran's ability to point to a humanitarian catastrophe as justification for escalation, while still applying maximum economic pressure exactly where it hurts the regime most. Now, Iran's response to 9 days of a completely dry terminal came yesterday, and it's worth walking through exactly what was said, because the contradiction inside it tells you a lot about where Tehran actually stands right now. Iran's foreign minister said publicly that talks being mediated through Oman are approaching their final stages, language that suggests real diplomatic movement, maybe even an imminent deal. Then, within a short window of that statement, Iran's Supreme National Security Council published a list of 6 conditions that would have to be met before the Strait of Hormuz reopens on Iran's terms. Lift the naval blockade. Lift the sanctions. Withdraw American forces from the entire region, not just from Iranian waters, the entire region. Pay reparations for the strikes that have already happened, and release frozen Iranian assets held abroad. Those are not the terms of a government that is one step away from signing a deal. Those are opening negotiating positions from a government trying to project strength to its own population and to hardline factions within its own security establishment while economic pressure builds in the background. And here's the distinction that actually matters, the one that a lot of coverage of this story gets wrong. Iran is not saying there are no negotiations happening. Iran is saying it refuses to be seen negotiating directly with the United States, even while American officials, including the president, have said they are directly involved in the talks. That's a face-saving move as much as it is a substantive negotiating position. Iran wants domestic and regional audiences to see Oman as the mediator and the United States as, at most, a background party, even if the reality on the ground is that Washington is very much at the table. Regimes under this kind of pressure often need to manage two audiences simultaneously, the actual counterpart they're negotiating with, and their own internal hardliners, who would treat any perceived capitulation as an existential threat to the leadership's legitimacy. The six conditions are partly real leverage and partly theater for internal consumption. Meanwhile, the tanker count near Kark Island tells its own story. As of this week, only 16 vessels are anchored near the island, the lowest number seen in months. Ships aren't loading, but they also aren't queuing up in large numbers waiting for the chance to load, which suggests shipping companies and their insurers have priced in the risk and are simply routing around the region rather than gambling on a short-term reopening. That's a meaningful signal. It means the economic pain isn't just being inflicted by the U.S. Navy turning ships around. It's being reinforced by the market itself, deciding that Iranian crude, for now, is not worth the risk. And then there's the incident that actually pushed regional politics into a new phase. On Saturday, a missile struck a tanker belonging to the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company inside the strait. The response from the UAE's foreign ministry did not use the usual careful, diplomatic hedging that Gulf states tend to reach for when discussing Iran. They called it what it was, an act of piracy. That kind of blunt language from a Gulf state that has spent years trying to maintain a working relationship with Tehran is a signal in itself. It suggests patience across the region is thinning, and that Iran's calculation that it can pressure its neighbors without triggering a unified response might be running into a wall. So now the question everyone keeps asking becomes obvious. Does the United States actually need to physically invade and hold Kark Island to finish this? A lot of people watching this unfold seem to assume that's the inevitable next step. Boots on the ground, a full amphibious assault, Marines securing the terminal the way you might picture from a previous generation of Gulf conflict. But that assumption deserves more scrutiny than it usually gets, because the tools available for this kind of operation have changed enormously in just the last few years, and the case for a traditional invasion is weaker than it might look on the surface. Think about what a conventional invasion of Kark Island would actually require. You'd need an amphibious landing force, air cover, suppression of any coastal defense systems Iran has positioned nearby, and then, critically, you'd need to hold the island afterward, which means putting American service members in a fixed, defensible position that Iran would know the exact coordinates of in advance. Iran doesn't need a sophisticated military to make that position miserable. It needs drone swarms, it needs rocket and mortar fire from the mainland, and it needs the willingness to throw every asset it has at a fixed American position. Because, from Tehran's perspective, American casualties on Iranian soil would be the single most valuable outcome available to them in this entire conflict. It would hand the regime a propaganda victory regardless of how the broader campaign is going, and it would create exactly the kind of political pressure back home in the United States that could shift the entire trajectory of the conflict. That's the trap a traditional invasion walks into. And it's also exactly why the newer tools being used in this campaign matter so much, because they offer a way to achieve the same strategic outcome, denying Iran the ability to use Kark Island without walking into that trap. Consider the unmanned surface vessel that's already become one of the most quietly consequential weapons in the Gulf. It's a 24-foot boat called the Corsair, built by a company called Saranac out of Austin, Texas, and it's operated by Naval Forces Central Command through Task Force 59, the Navy's dedicated unmanned systems unit. This boat first became widely known not for a strike, but for a rescue. On the 8th of June, an Army AH-64 Apache went down in the water off the coast of Oman, and it was a Corsair, not a manned helicopter, not a rescue swimmer, that got to the downed aviators first. Both crew members were out of the water and stable within about 2 hours. That's the first personnel recovery in history conducted by an autonomous surface vessel. And it's worth pausing on that fact alone because it tells you these systems aren't just weapons platforms. They're becoming genuine force multipliers across the entire spectrum of naval operations, from strike to reconnaissance to search and rescue. The specifications on the Corsair are worth knowing too, because they explain why the Navy has been so aggressive about scaling this program. It's 24 feet long, carries up to 1,000 pounds of payload, has a range beyond 1,000 nautical miles, and can move at speeds over 35 knots. In December of last year, the Navy handed Saranac a production contract worth $392 million, and by this past May, the company said it had already built more than 300 of these boats. Earlier this year, 8 Corsairs ran a multi-day campaign more than 70 nautical miles offshore, logging over 4,500 nautical miles while conducting autonomous harbor transits, long-range patrols, and loiter missions, all while their communications links were deliberately denied to test how they'd perform if Iran tried to jam them. And they kept working. That's the detail that should actually worry Tehran the most, because it means these systems don't depend on a constant, uninterrupted signal back to a human operator. even under electronic warfare conditions. They can continue their mission, which strongly suggests there's meaningful onboard autonomy handling navigation and target discrimination. These aren't just used for patrol and rescue either. One of these unmanned boats has already been used to strike a pier at a naval facility and damage a submarine berthed there, hitting an Iranian naval base at Bandar Abbas directly. That's a genuinely new capability. The United States can now put ordnance on an Iranian military target without a single American sailor being anywhere near the blast radius. And it can do it with a platform cheap enough and numerous enough that losing one in the process barely registers as a strategic setback. Then there's a system that hasn't been confirmed as operational yet, but represents where this technology is heading even faster than the Corsair does. It's called the Lamprey, an autonomous undersea vehicle built by Lockheed Martin, named after the parasitic fish that clamps onto sharks and rides along with them. The Lamprey uses suction anchors to physically attach itself to the unmodified hull of a submarine or a surface warship, and once attached, it uses small turbines to generate power from the water flowing past as the host vessel moves, essentially getting a free ride and a free battery charge to wherever it's going. It has a 24 cubic foot payload bay, enough room to carry torpedoes, decoys, equipment that can be dropped directly onto the seabed, or even small aerial drones that it can launch once it's near its target. Lockheed built it entirely with internal company funding in about 14 months, unveiled it as a prototype in February, and by all indications, it's currently in sea trials. There's no announced Navy contract yet and no confirmed combat deployment, and that honesty matters, because it would be easy to overstate where this program actually stands. But the concept alone tells you where naval warfare in this theater is heading. A system that can silently hitch a ride on an adversary's own vessel and then deploy weapons or surveillance assets from underneath it without ever needing a manned platform nearby is exactly the kind of asymmetric tool that makes a small, aggressive regional power like Iran extremely difficult to plan against. Put those two systems together, the Corsair on the surface and something like the Lamprey underneath, and you start to see the outline of a genuinely different way of thinking about taking or denying Kark Island if it ever comes to that. Instead of a beach landing, you could see waves of autonomous surface boats running suppression and strike missions against coastal defenses, undersea systems disabling or tracking Iranian naval assets before they can even respond, drones overhead providing targeting data in real time, and manned fighter aircraft like the Super Hornets and F-35s providing overwatch and heavier strike capability when needed, all of it happening without a single Marine or soldier standing on Iranian soil where Iran could throw everything it has at them. It's essentially turning Iran's own preferred tactics back against it. Iran has spent years building a reputation around cheap, expendable drone and missile systems, the Shahed family being the most obvious example, systems designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers and low cost per unit. What's happening in the Gulf right now looks a lot like the United States adopting that same logic, but applying it with a much larger industrial base, much more sophisticated autonomy, and much deeper integration with space-based and airborne surveillance. That surveillance layer deserves its own explanation, because it's easy to miss how much of this campaign depends on things that never make it into a headline. The Space Force recently selected Rocket Lab, a company called Systems Technology Research, and a third undisclosed contractor for a $650 million program to build satellites specifically designed to track aircraft and missile threats from orbit. Rocket Lab's share of that award is around $397 million, and the satellites involved are designed as what's called a proliferated constellation, meaning dozens or potentially hundreds of smaller satellites working together rather than a handful of large, expensive, individually vulnerable ones. The program is officially called the Space-Based Airborne Moving Target Indicator Program, and its purpose is straightforward: provide persistent surveillance over areas where traditional airborne early warning aircraft, the big AWACS-style planes, can't safely operate because they'd be too easy for an adversary like China or Iran to shoot down. For decades, the United States relied on those large surveillance aircraft circling for hours at a time to build a picture of what was moving in contested airspace, and that worked fine when the adversaries in question didn't have credible long-range air defense systems. That calculation has changed. Modern surface-to-air systems and the proliferation of advanced fighters among potential adversaries mean those AWACS-style aircraft are now considered high-value, high-risk targets in a serious conflict. Moving that surveillance function into orbit removes the target entirely. You can't shoot down a satellite the way you can shoot down an aircraft, at least not without an entirely different and far more escalatory set of weapons. And a proliferated constellation means even losing a few satellites doesn't meaningfully degrade the overall picture. That kind of persistent space-based tracking is exactly what makes the current blockade around Kark Island as effective as it is. It's not just ships and aircraft watching the water. It's a layered system where satellites, aircraft, and naval assets are all feeding into the same picture. which is how you get precise enough intelligence to distinguish a humanitarian aid ship from a sanctioned oil tanker in real time, and why more than 50 vessels have been turned back with only a handful actually needing to be boarded or disabled. There's also a broader reorganization happening that's worth understanding, because it shows this isn't an isolated Gulf operation. It's part of a larger shift in how the United States is structuring its military posture globally. On the 3rd of August, Southern Command activated a new joint task force covering the Western Hemisphere, under a Marine Major General, replacing a temporary task force structure and folding in 18 partner nations as part of a broader counter-cartel coalition across the Americas. On the surface, that seems unrelated to what's happening in the Persian Gulf, but the underlying logic is identical. These are the same categories of tools: autonomous surface vessels, persistent drone surveillance, integrated intelligence sharing, being applied to a completely different mission set, disrupting cartel supply chains and narcotics trafficking rather than oil exports. What that tells you is that the Pentagon isn't building these autonomous and space-based capabilities as a one-off solution for Iran specifically. It's building a general-purpose toolkit for exactly this kind of persistent, high-tempo, low-casualty pressure campaign, and it's rolling that toolkit out simultaneously across multiple regions and multiple mission types. Kark Island and the Strait of Hormuz blockade might be the most visible current example, but it's really a live demonstration of a capability set that's going to define how the United States projects power for the next decade. It's also worth taking a step back and putting Kark Island in its proper historical context, because this is not the first time the island has been targeted, and the history actually reinforces the argument against a traditional ground assault. During the Iran-Iraq War, in what became known as the Tanker War, the United States struck Iranian oil infrastructure directly on 2 separate occasions, in 1987 and again in 1988, as part of operations meant to protect international shipping and punish Iranian attacks on neutral tankers. Kark Island was hit during that period, and it survived. The facility was damaged, exports were disrupted temporarily, but Iran rebuilt and the terminal came back online. That history tells you 2 things. First, that Kark Island has always been a target, and Iran has always known it's a target, which means whatever defenses exist around it now have had decades to be planned and reinforced with that history in mind. Second, and more importantly, it tells you that simply striking the facility doesn't produce a permanent solution. Iran rebuilt after the 1980 strikes. If the goal now is a durable reduction in Iran's ability to fund its regional proxy network through oil exports, a one-time strike or even a temporary occupation doesn't solve that problem. What solves it is sustained pressure, the kind that a blockade combined with persistent autonomous surveillance and interdiction can provide indefinitely, without requiring a permanent American ground presence that would itself become a long-term target and a long-term political liability back home. There's a comment from the Secretary of Defense that's worth sitting with too, because it points toward where this entire strategic picture is heading over the medium term. He said that within a few years, the Strait of Hormuz will not carry the volume of global oil flow that it does today, not even close, because the plan is to shift a much larger share of that oil through underground pipelines that bypass the strait entirely. If that shift actually happens at scale, it fundamentally changes the leverage Iran has held for decades. The entire reason the Strait of Hormuz matters as much as it does in global energy politics is that it's a choke point, a narrow waterway only about 21 miles across at its narrowest point, through which a huge percentage of the world's seaborne oil has to pass. That geography has given Iran outsized leverage relative to its actual economic or military size for a very long time, because the credible threat of disrupting that choke point has always been enough to rattle global energy markets and force other powers to tread carefully. If the infrastructure shifts toward pipelines that don't depend on that choke point, Iran loses one of the very few genuine strategic cards it's been able to play on the world stage. That's a long-term structural change, not something that happens overnight, but it explains a lot about why Tehran might be feeling more urgency right now than the day-to-day headlines suggest. The current blockade is painful in the short term, but the pipeline shift represents something worse for Iran, a future in which the leverage that's defined Iranian foreign policy for generations simply stops existing. Meanwhile, on a completely separate front, the Russia-Ukraine war continues to grind forward with the kind of mutual, unresolved exchange that's defined most of this conflict. Ukrainian drones struck Russia's Belgorod region overnight, while Russian missiles hit a high-rise residential building in Kiev's Solomyansky district. Russia's defense ministry claimed it shot down over 150 Ukrainian drones during the night, though that figure comes from Russian sources, and should be treated as a claim rather than a verified fact, since neither side in this war has been a particularly reliable narrator of its own losses or successes. There were casualties reported on both sides. What this really reflects is a conflict that has settled into a pattern where neither side currently has the capability to deliver a decisive knockout blow, but both sides retain enough long-range strike capacity, Ukraine, through increasingly capable drone systems, Russia threw its much larger ballistic and cruise missile inventory to keep inflicting damage deep behind the front lines indefinitely. It's a sobering parallel to draw alongside the Gulf situation because it's a reminder of what happens when a conflict lacks either a decisive military resolution or a genuine diplomatic off-ramp. It just continues month after month, extracting a steady cost without a clear endpoint. That's exactly the outcome a well-designed pressure campaign against Iran is trying to avoid, an indefinite grinding standoff with no resolution. The entire logic behind combining a tight economic blockade with the credible threat of asymmetric low-casualty strike options is to create enough pressure that Iran actually comes to the table on realistic terms, rather than settling into a permanent state of low-level conflict the way Russia and Ukraine effectively have. So where does this actually go from here? 9 days of zero exports through Kark Island is already an extraordinary amount of economic pressure on a regime that depends on that revenue to fund everything from its domestic security apparatus to the network of proxy militias it backs across the region. Add to that a set of 6 demands from Iran's Supreme National Security Council that read far more like an opening negotiating position than a genuine roadmap to de-escalation. A foreign minister simultaneously claiming talks are nearing their final stages. A tanker count near the island sitting at its lowest level in months, and a Gulf ally now openly accusing Iran of piracy after a missile strike on one of its tankers. And you have a situation that looks less like a stable standoff and more like a pressure cooker approaching some kind of decision point. The honest answer to the question of whether Kark Island gets physically invaded is that it probably doesn't need to be, at least not in the traditional sense most people picture when they hear the word invasion. The blockade alone is already achieving the core strategic objective, cutting off the revenue that funds the regime without requiring a single American service member to set foot on Iranian soil. And if additional pressure becomes necessary, if the diplomatic track collapses entirely and Iran continues trying to force open the strait through attacks like the one that hit the Emirati tanker, the tools available now, autonomous surface boats, undersea systems, space-based tracking, advanced fighter cover, offer a way to escalate that pressure dramatically without walking into the trap that a traditional ground invasion would represent. Iran's entire military strategy for decades has been built around the assumption that any American ground presence in the region eventually becomes a fixed target that can be worn down through asymmetric attrition. The systems being deployed right now are specifically designed to deny Iran that opportunity, applying overwhelming pressure while removing the fixed, vulnerable targets that pressure has traditionally required. What happens next depends heavily on what Iran's leadership decides those 6 conditions actually mean in practice. If they're a genuine floor for negotiation, a starting position designed to be whittled down through the Oman-mediated channel, then there's a realistic path towards some kind of settlement that reopens Kark Island under new terms, probably terms that include far more intrusive monitoring of Iranian oil exports and continued restrictions on how that revenue can be used. If instead they're a rigid position that Tehran's hardline factions won't allow to be softened, then the blockade likely continues indefinitely, the economic pressure keeps compounding day after day, and the risk of further incidents, like the tanker strike near the UAE, keeps climbing. Either way, the underlying capability the United States has built here, a networked, largely autonomous, persistent pressure system spanning sea, air, undersea, and space, isn't going away, regardless of how this particular standoff resolves. It's the new baseline for how this kind of regional pressure campaign gets waged. And Kark Island is simply the first place the world is watching it play out in real time.